Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome to the Society and the State podcast. Brian Hyde here along with Connor Boyack. And Connor, I think we should probably confess straight up, we've been looking for an appropriate guest to discuss this topic because this can be a very touchy topic. And I'm talking about immigration. Why is this one that just tends to polarize people so severely?
I think fundamentally, as we've seen throughout the centuries, especially on the immigration issue, it's a very sensitive issue for people when it comes to jobs. I think that's what a lot of this boils down to. More now is the welfare state, but historically and even today, it's this concern about jobs. And when you're talking about a policy that might make someone lose their job or they're worried about that, it's this very visceral reaction that they have to the issue. It's very hard to rationally discuss a principle or a policy when people, feel this one so passionately and intensely.
Yeah, I know in the years that I was on the radio, if I wanted to stir up an argument, not that anybody would want to do that, but all I had to do was mention immigration and boom, the phones would go nuts and people would be just dug in, ready to fight to the death for whatever side of this issue they were on.
I read an article over the weekend, I believe it was in the New York Times, talking about a city in Idaho recently where it was alleged that these Muslim immigrants were, raping and overtaking government, just all these blown out of proportion issues, none of which were true. It was this refugee situation. And so this reporter was going in there to analyze what had happened, that the community blew this thing way out of scale. People were calling into the talk radio shows and they were writing letters to the editor, and things were just, I think it was Twin Falls, actually.
It was my old stomping grounds.
There you go. And we'll have to link to that on today's show notes page, which is societyandthestate.com/36. And it was a fascinating article to look at the article was about a couple different things, especially about the ability of fake news to kind of engineer, these emotions and create this backlash. But what I found interesting about the article was the underlying issue was this immigration of the other, right? These people who we're skeptical of, we're fearful of, and we don't assume the best intentions. We don't give a benefit of the doubt. By default, the reaction of so many to these immigrants is a negative one. You're competition, you're hostile, you're different, you're going to change our culture, you might, rape and pillage along the way, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's been very sad for me because I spent about 20 years of my life living in Twin Falls. And one of the reasons why there are so many immigrants in that area is because the College of Southern Idaho has a refugee program. And I mean, back in the early 90s, there were people coming from the former Soviet bloc countries, relocating. So you had lots of Muslims coming from some of those areas. And anyway, there's a great deal of fear that plays into the immigration question. And that's why I guess it becomes so heavily polarized. The fear of the other, as you put it, I'm going to just stick my neck out and say I think that stems a lot from people not having contact with the other.
There's a fascinating guy by the name of Rick Steves. And if our listeners don't know who Rick Steves is, he is, the travel guru. He writes those manuals that, if you're going to go to Poland on vacation, right, or Italy, you can go by the Rick Steves Guide to Italy, and he'll show you where to go and how to, talk and how to, get intermingle with, the culture and the people and so forth. So he's got a lot of great stuff for those who are traveling. But he's also done some interesting documentaries. I found a very interesting one a couple years ago he had done on Iran. And it was this is a total tangent, but it was amazing because he got access to go into Iran. He shot this amazing hour-long documentary. And, he had a tail. That was the arrangement, was the government agent was there to make sure he wasn't doing anything bad or wrong or that would upset the establishment in Iran. But what was interesting was the culture and the people and the relics and the nature. And he would interview people on the street and they're like, we love America. I know our governments are kind of, at each other's throats, but we love Americans, and he was just blown away by how normal Iranians were. And so he wrote an op-ed we'll have to link to on this issue where he talked about how one of the biggest problems with America is the lack of travel. And what he was getting at was when you haven't intermingled with people who are not like you, you are distrustful of them. You are fearful of them. You want to alienate them from you. And so Americans are really good at navel gazing. We're the freest country in America, and we do American history, but world history, who cares? Because they're not America. And I think over time that has exacerbated the issue to the point where other people have a high literacy about American culture and even history, but we don't really know about, let alone care about everyone outside of those borders of America. And so what that's done is it's fomented this fear and this visceral reaction to immigrants. I really appreciated his op-ed because it says, like, look, as you get out and see the world, you fear less, you understand more. And I think the immigration issue is best approached from that vantage point that, you know, from my religious perspective, we're all children of God. We all have rights. These are my brothers and sisters. They have different backgrounds and perspectives, but I'd like to have an open dialogue and a bridge rather than a wall.
I think the biggest problem I see with the immigration issue is the same problem I see with a lot of other issues, and that is once it becomes politicized, and I think we can safely say it's become heavily politicized.
Build the wall.
Yeah, then it just becomes a big power struggle. And so it's, it's pitting our group against their group, and that's where, the fear-mongering comes in. Fred Reed is an American expatriate. He's a former U.S. Marine. I mean, he's been a writer for years. He was a cop at one point in his life. He has expatriated from the U.S. to Mexico. And he's a really, he's a curmudgeonly writer, but I like his directness because I think he says things that other people would like to say but are too polite or too afraid to say. And one of the things he points out is he says, a lot of Americans north of the Rio Grande tend to think of Mexico as a place where there's a bunch of peasants and burros napping, having a siesta, under their sombrero or whatever. And he says, you'd be very surprised to find out that Mexico is a thoroughly modern country. They have Wi-Fi, they have good dentists, they have all the things that you would expect, and they don't see things exactly the same way that we see them in America. In other words, the things that we think are great about our country, they see slightly different, especially stemming back to a little dust up back in about 1848.
Mm-hmm. I think on this, I'm going to lay my cards out on the table on this one. I support what is often pejoratively called open borders. More specifically, I support the immigration policy of the first century of the American nation, the one that was reflected on the poem engraved on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And that poem paints a picture that's faded into American history. For the first century, politically, legally, culturally, there was effectively an open door. That door had a little bit of a gate. There were health checks and very minimal, immigration qualifications just to make sure that people were okay. But it was very much this welcoming approach. Come help us build this nation. Be a part of this experiment. Come and join us. We welcome you. And instead, it's now a closed door, a quota. Sorry, we imported too many Armenians. We can't have one more. And I don't think that's right. I think, Brian, that you have the right to reside in and travel to anywhere on the world. Now, obviously, we have many rights that are frustrated or violated by the government. You have the right to keep and bear arms, but if you're in California or Russia,
but you repeat yourself.
Exactly. You're not going to be able to exercise that right. But the exercise of a right is different from the actual possession of it. And I think you have the right. I think I have the right to reside where we want. If there is someone in Belarus or someone in Sudan who has land and has a home for you to stay at, has a business you can work at, I think you have the right to go there. I think that person has the right to your companionship and friendship and being able to welcome you and help build something amazing down there. That, unfortunately, is a right that I don't think any nation really, truly recognizes in our modern era.
If a person were to take what you're saying at face value, Connor, they might be led to believe that where a person is born doesn't constitute some kind of a lifelong contract to which they are bound and is immovable, regarding where their loyalties should lie forever and ever. Amen.
I think that's exactly right.
Okay.
I'm
saying this tongue in cheek, but I want to play devil's advocate a little bit for you.
Let's do it.
So the open borders, what about, let's take two things, welfare benefits and jobs. If we have open borders, won't people come here just to take advantage of the American taxpayer and to take away their jobs that they deserve to be working?
So let me maybe pause the conversation before we get into the rebuttals to first make the case a little bit more for the why before we go in and try and deconstruct it, because we can't really. I think it's unfair to rebut an argument that hasn't been fully fleshed out, right? And so the argument, perhaps building upon what I said, is that I have the right to travel. So let's say I live in Utah, and I want my friend Jose from Honduras to be able to come and stay with us and get an education up here at a school that will admit him and work with me. I'll hire Jose, right? And you can stay at my house. And I think I have that right. I think that's a right of mutual contract and exchange. I think under the, basically any rational view of what the legitimate proper role of government is, it would be very hard to say that my neighbors writ large, collectively through the government, can combine together to say, no, we don't want Jose staying with you. The biggest impediment to that, getting to your questions, is the communalization of property, roads specifically. Well, Jose can't get to your house, so, sure, if you want a helicopter in and he stays confined in your home, we're not going to argue. But if he's going to our parks and he's driving on our roads, we get a say in who gets to go on those roads.
Breathing our air.
And he's breathing our air. He's looking at our view shed, And so these are the arguments, rather than private property rights, rather than contract, rather than mutual agreement. It's the collectivization of property that I think has created the weak link in this argument. It's unfortunate because, again, when you go back and you look at Supreme Court decisions, when you look at treaties, when you look at statements from, the Republican Party, I think it was a decade after they started. This was 1864. The federal government was just starting to get involved in immigration. But even then, it was a liberal policy. It was designed to kind of welcome more, but systematize it so that you didn't have this patchwork of state policies. But even then, 1864, the Republican Party comes out and says, foreign immigration, which has added so much to the wealth, resources, and increase of power to this nation, the asylum of the oppressed to all nations, should be fostered and encouraged by a liberal and just policy. And so many Republicans, many people today will say, oh, no, I want broader immigration. We just have to have them come in through the front door. We have to, we have to have controls. Well, okay, but where in the Constitution is the federal government given power to have control?
This is where a lot of people confuse naturalization, which is one of the functions of the federal government, with immigration.
Precisely. I'm glad you pointed that out, because in the first several decades, the Supreme Court validated that as well. They specifically said that immigration was, and I quote, a power which rightfully belonged to the states. Immigration, like any other power not delegated to the federal government, was intended to be held back by the states. Now, of course, when all the states were primarily adjoining water and could have their own ports and so forth, that made a little more sense. That gets complicated when you have landlocked states where maybe you are helicoptering or flying, right, immigrants in, and so it's not as big a deal anymore. But the courts consistently recognized early on that this was a power of the states. The federal government could say, well, you don't get to become a U.S. citizen until you've been here for 20 years, or until you can do 50 push-ups, or like whatever they want, right? Because the federal government has the power over, as you point out, naturalization, which only deals with citizenship. The power for immigration, dictating who could be admitted and under what conditions, was left to the states. And so for people who say, well, come in the front door and we got to have, rules and everything. Well, I don't necessarily dispute that. I just dispute that it's the federal government's job, to do that. It'd be great to see a state like ours, Utah, which has been very welcoming of refugees and so forth, to have a more liberal immigration policy. We'll show the rest of the world how it's done. We'll have compassion. We'll live that poem on the Statue of Liberty and show, what things can look like. So let's maybe now, I guess, Brian, that I've articulated that a bit more. Throw one of those at me again. What was the?
But what about the people who come here and get on welfare and take advantage of the taxpayer? What about the jobs and opportunities that Americans should be able to have access to? Aren't they going to take those things away from us?
So I have a problem with denying someone their rights because of bad policy elsewhere. I have a hard time telling Jose, sorry, you and I have a hard time being told that me and Jose can't have this mutual contract, that Jose can't come and build a better life and provide for his family because other immigrants might take advantage, of the welfare system. If we're really that concerned with the welfare system, let's start deporting Americans who live entirely on the welfare system. I mean, let's not discriminate, right? Like, why is it that we're okay with newborn Americans being on the dole throughout their life, but people who were birthed outside of the jurisdictional borders of the United States don't get to enjoy the same thing? So I think it's discriminatory. I think that argument falls apart. What would be fantastic is to see the immigration policy change. If you somehow sign some waiver, we would create some sort of legal contract or waiver where Jose could say, I will never go on the dole. So this argument falls apart, and he could guarantee to, American taxpayers that you don't have to pay for me. I'm on the hook for myself. If Connor can't help me, this business doesn't go for it, I'm going back home. That'd be great, right? And then that argument falls apart.
It's a classic case, too, though, of straining at the symptoms without looking at the root problem. The symptom is, well, we do have people coming here, immigrating here, and getting on the dole. The problem really is, though, why does the dole exist in the first place to the extent that it does? And that's something not very many Americans are willing to look at. And you're right, by the way, when you say, if you want to see who's really abusing that system, it's our good red, white, and blue Americans.
And there's actually some studies talking about immigration dependence on the welfare system. And the argument that immigrants more heavily use welfare, right, or that they're abusing it at any higher rate, I think is invalid. I think it's not the problem that it's perceived to be. But on the flip side, I've sometimes said, somewhat in jest, but not entirely, that maybe that's okay. Let's have an influx of immigrants who enroll in the welfare system and help bankrupt it. Let's accelerate the implosion of this system, right? Because that would be a welcome thing. Because now we realize we can't afford all this stuff. It's time to reanalyze that policy and only have an actual safety net as it was intended, rather than this bloated, cart of goodies for everyone who qualifies.
Okay, so let's talk about jobs, because this seems to be one that a lot of people, especially in high growth areas in Utah where we live, has seen a great deal of growth in construction. And I've heard from a number of people in the construction industry, painters, drywallers, roofers. Well, the illegals come in and they take away our jobs. How do we answer that objection?
I think those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it, right? When you look at this issue, immigration really boils down, as I said at the outset, to jobs, especially when you look at an American policy. When immigration was at a state level, the reason why it became a federal issue was because of the upward political pressure, primarily from California, beginning around the gold rush, where people were getting very upset that all these Chinese immigrants were coming in droves to try their hand at mining for riches and exploring all kinds of related industries. And many of the Chinese workforce became employed on the Transcontinental Railroad project, and they were competing with Americans for day labor jobs. And so, of course, this doesn't sit well with people who feel entitled to so-called American jobs. And so the Chinese as a bloc became perceived as an economic threat. And, San Francisco by this time, it became a melting pot of, all sorts of different races and so forth. And so there was this protest in 1870 by some factory workers in San Francisco, and they rallied around the slogan, "The Chinese must go." And this quickly seeped into American culture. When you look at the political cartoons of the day, the Chinese were just maligned. It was absolutely racist because of this perception that they were an economic threat. And so municipal laws began to be passed, state laws began to be passed, specifically targeting the Chinese population. Some focused on industries that were dominated by the Chinese, such as laundries were really popular back in the day. San Francisco, for example, passed an ordinance that forbade people from walking on sidewalks with a pole and baskets over their shoulders, which was often done by the Chinese. And so these laws were, targeting people. But so this pressure mounted from these Western states to try and get the federal government to institute some sort of restrictions. And so in 1880, the president, which no one's ever heard of this guy, Rutherford B. Hayes, right? Like, who's ever heard of, as President Hayes once said. But he was able to amend this treaty that was signed 22 years before in a pact with China to recognize the right of migration. So this was a positive treaty. And before it was amended, so for over 2 decades, this treaty said the United States of America and the Emperor of China cordially recognize the inherent and inalienable right of man to, Brian, as you said, change his home and allegiance, and also the mutual advantage of the free migration and emigration of their citizens and subjects, respectively, from the one country to the other for purposes of curiosity, of trade, or as permanent residence. And so these were very liberal policies. Our early founding documents, these early treaties and court rulings recognized this right, but it was jobs that began to undermine it. It was jobs that created the political pressure to violate that right and to change the culture to not even understand that what that right is. People don't get that that's a right. People think right to life, right to guns, right to, now it's healthcare and cake baking.
Education.
Education, right? And so now it's like, oh, that right? No, wait, what? I didn't learn that in school. That's not right. So to address the question, the whole reason I segued in from that is to address the question today, we have to look at the history in the past. This is nothing new. And, I'm from San Diego, and immigration there is a pretty heavy thing, right? We would have employ people at our home routinely to help do, yard work and cleaning and other stuff. And it was great. And our family became really great friends with Felipe, who was there for years. And like Felipe, I'm sorry, Felipe worked harder than anyone I have ever seen. You send Felipe in your backyard, he will come out with 12 trash bags full of yard matter and weeds. Like, he was just the most hardworking guy, saving for his family, decent man. And when he finally decided to return, I believe it was Mexico, could have been a Central American country. I was younger, so I don't recall. My family sent him packing with, some money and provisions. Like, he was just a decent man trying to work hard. And so in San Diego, right, there was competition for jobs. You drive by Home Depot and there'd be a line of immigrants, illegal, right, immigrants, quote unquote. And, you'd say, oh, I need 3. And they'd hop in your truck and you'd take them out to your, construction site or field or whatever, and they'd do the work. And, that was great. So it is competition, and it stinks, right? Because some Americans have a drywall business or construction business, and they see that as competition. I'm sorry, but I believe in a free market, and immigration controls are arbitrary restrictions on a free market. I believe in free market, not just of property, but of people. And if Felipe or whoever is going to work at half the price and work twice as hard, I'm hiring Felipe every day of the week. And that's tough to hear for people who have a business that are in competition. They want protectionism. They want, like the auto dealers, to be protected from the Teslas of the world. They want to be able to say, well, that's illegal, and have the conversation end there. But I think we need to change that conversation, because if we truly believe in a free market, if we truly believe in property rights, then we have to be okay with the turbulence that those things inevitably bring, right? The candle makers, I'm sorry, they went out of business. That's a good thing for society. If construction, if fields, like you look out at the fields now and all the toxicity from Trump and everything, you see fields in California now where they can't hire workers, right? People are leaving the country on their own. There's more immigration enforcement. And so entire fields are now not being harvested because they can't find the help. That's not good for society. I don't see any gringos who have been claiming, oh, that's competition. They're not running out for those jobs. So that's suggesting that there is a place for immigrants, and we shouldn't be turning them away out of this economic fear. So that would be how I would respond.
Okay, one final objection that I often hear related to immigration, and that is, but what about dangerous people? Criminals, terrorists, people who would come to this country with no intention of assimilating into our culture.
So to the latter part, I would say there's a lot about American culture that I would not want to assimilate anybody into, right? But speaking more broadly, I think that's a fair argument. How do they kind of weave into society and be assimilate, right, to be one of us and so forth? Well, first, I think we're strengthened through diversity. I think it's great that people bring their cultures and differences, and I wouldn't want them to abandon that outright. I know one gentleman who every time there's a crime that involves an illegal immigrant will post on Facebook and complain, and the sky is falling, and look, this is a problem with immigration. It's never about the crime. It's never about the action, the person himself. This is a symptom of immigration. Well, that's ridiculous, right? Because there's plenty of, purebred Americans whose mothers gave birth to them within the jurisdictional boundaries of these imaginary lines,
All right and proper.
right, who do those things and worse. So I don't know that there's any data to substantiate that immigrants are more dangerous than others. I think in a post 9/11 world, right, there's a lot of more sensitivity to Muslims, but then you get people who are like Buddhist or not even Muslim, and they're being targeted by people who don't know any better. Yeah, the Sikhs, absolutely. And so I don't know that it's fair to say that dangerous people is a symptom of illegal immigration. If we have zero immigration, there will still be dangerous people doing bad things. There were dangerous people doing bad things in America, 150 years ago when you had more of an open policy. Hey, some of them might be in my genealogical line, right? But how fortunate I am that they happen to be here so I can exist.
Just a bit of perspective too. Since you mentioned 9/11, I know that's kind of the benchmark people have. Everything has changed since 9/11. Homegrown criminals, in other words, Americans, just like you were describing, are responsible for about 3,000 murders every month. That's, as many people as died in the 9/11 attacks die at the hands of homegrown criminals here in America every month. Now, I'm not trying to play on fears here. I'm just trying to provide a little bit of perspective. There are some people who come here illegally who are involved in criminal things. There are also a lot of people who come here illegally who find the free market opportunities here, the personal liberties here, so good that they adapt their lives to it because they have found a better way. And I think that I speak with confidence to the systems, the good things that we have, the good principles that we stand on, I think are more powerful than whatever faults some of these people or, whatever ideas they bring with them that may not be compatible with American culture.
Thomas Jefferson talked about how timid men are afraid of the tempestuous. They prefer the calm of despotism to the tempestuous sea of liberty. It is very easy to say, we're just going to ban all immigrants. We're just going to clamp down. We don't want these dangerous people. So we're going to have despotism. We're going to violate people's rights. They can't, mutually exchange and change allegiances and locations. No, we're not going to have that. Yes, the sea of liberty is tempestuous. Giving people their freedom, some of them will do stupid stuff. There will be problems with that. But the net outcome is a net positive, even though there's problems along the way. I think of gun control, right? Like, people saying, oh, it's because he had an automatic weapon or semi-auto, he had a rifle. Like, they point to these little elements of a much bigger problem. Like, what was his mental health, and like, people fixate on things. To fixate on the fact that it was an illegal immigrant who did a bad thing, I think is the wrong question to be asking. But fundamentally, for me, on this issue, it comes down to this. It is wrong to violate one person's rights because of the potential negative actions of another. It's wrong to tell me that I can't rent out my home on a short-term basis to people on Airbnb because someone else might do a party house. It's wrong to tell me that I can't conceal carry a weapon because someone else might use a firearm to hurt people. It's wrong to restrict my rights because of the speculative, potential, and highly unlikely negative actions of another. And too often in government, what we see is the few, the vocal minority, who cry uncle and they say, oh, but my job, and that ends up being shaped into policy where everyone's rights are narrowed and infringed because of this unlikelihood that, sure, having a more liberal immigration policy, there are going to be some bad people who are going to come in. But who would come in that would have an offsetting and disproportionate impact, right? Where are the geniuses? Where are the leaders? Where are the innovators and entrepreneurs who, there's some bad elements that are coming in, but who are we not letting in right now that would make the world a better place? But because we're violating their rights, we're all the worse off for it, right? That's what I think of. And I don't like this issue because for many people, it becomes so emotional and people don't think about the principle. And that's tough. It's tough to get through to people when it's just, oh, but jobs and oh, crime. And it's tough to get those types of people to separate their emotions from the arguments and the ideas. Brian, you're as sensitive to this as anyone, being on the radio and understanding that people just react. How do you, whether this issue or something else, is there a way that we can build bridges to people on this idea. Is there any opportunity to change this policy, or are we forever condemned that, those arguments that you've raised are just going to carry the day?
I think what we need to do is we need to link to your book, Feardom, because I really believe if you want to get to what's at the root of why people dig in ideologically on this, it's really rooted in fear. And I'll be the first to admit the worst decisions I make in my life are the ones that I make based in fear.
Well, I'm slipping Brian a $5 bill referral fee right now. You guys can't see, so
I actually think this would be a good one. So we'll have a link to Connor's book. We'll have a link to is it Rick Steves?
Rick Steves.
We'll have his article,
his op-ed, the New York Times article I mentioned. We, like Brian said, we were struggling to find someone who's written eloquently enough or has made a really good case for it, and we just said, let's just chat about it ourselves. I think that went well. It's an interesting issue, right? Because it's such a different world that we experience today. And what I find often is people will say, oh, but that's just the way things used to be. We've evolved since then. So I'm okay with open borders a century ago, but that wouldn't work in our world. We're so different.
Human nature is totally different. No, it's not.
Right. There's never been terrorism or crime before. No.
Bad things didn't happen before 9/11.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, that wraps it up. We'll end it there. Stay tuned for the next episode. Let's see. This was citingthestate.com/36. The next episode, we're going to be talking to Brian McClanahan, who has a new book out. Talk about people during the founding era and how much we've changed since then. Well, it works in the reverse too. You have people destroying the nascent, the new American experiment, and yet now the guy is glorified. We're going to be talking about Alexander Hamilton, how he screwed up America. Brian McClanahan's got a new book, so make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.